Louis Arnot is an anagram for Usopp, not liar. I think Louis Arnot and the book Bragman is a lot more important than we realize, and let me tell you why. So we recently saw the return of Louis Arnot in One Piece, with the explorer making his return by making some pretty ominous remarks about Elbaf. But we have already discussed that warning, and if you haven't checked that video out, then I recommend you to do so. But today, something that I found really interesting and something I think we do need to discuss further is the book itself. This book that we were introduced to all the way back in the Little Garden arc, all the way back in chapter 115, Bragman, a fictional romance. Now, I'm not actually certain that Louis' remarks from chapter 1132 were actually contained in Bragman. The narration box just said that it was a quote from Louis, not necessarily that it was a quote out of the Bragman book, which is what happened in chapter 115 when Nami was actually reading out from that book. But I am going to assume that that quote is also from the book. I mean, we have that book for a reason, and that sort of message about a legendary island, that's exactly the type of thing that I would expect to be in Bragman. Anyways, regardless of whether the quote was from the book itself or not, this callback to Louis Arnot is obviously very fitting. The Little Garden arc is, of course, the same arc where we were actually first introduced to giants in the series, and therefore by extension also the first time that we had ever heard of Elbaf. Elbaf, the legendary kingdom of brave warriors. So it seems only right, very fitting that in the same arc and the very same chapter that we are really properly introduced to Elbaf, Louis also makes a reappearance. And that's what I initially thought, that this book, this quote, it's a nice little callback. Whereas now, I have a sneaking suspicion that Louis and the book Bragman, they are a lot more significant than we previously thought. But before I explain why, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm on a mission to get to 100,000 subscribers and I need your help. Subscribing will also mean that you get more One Piece discussions and that I would be forever grateful. Now, for those of you who had forgotten about Bragman, like I said, it was introduced to us back in the Little Garden arc, and in fact, it actually seems like it was Louis Arnot himself who named the island Little Garden, commenting that because of the island's inhabitants, the island truly is like a small garden. We should therefore call it Little Garden, the land of giants. Of course, the irony being the island is actually not just home to two Elbafian giants, but also various colossal prehistoric creatures like dinosaurs. Which, by the way, has always made me wonder, does this mean that Bragman was only created in the last 100 years or so? And was Louis referring to Dorian Broggy when he mentioned giants? Or was he actually just talking about the dinosaurs? Or was the book published even before Dorian Broggy made their way to Little Garden, and was Louis only referring to the dinosaurs as giants? Now you can leave your thoughts on that. So after we were first briefly introduced to this book in the Little Garden arc, we also saw it again in chapter 397 back in the O'Hara incident, in the flashback to the O'Hara incident, and it was one of the books that the O'Haran scholars were throwing out the window into the lake to save from the fires of the Buster Call. And in fact, it wasn't just simply any one of the books. Oda actually dedicated an entire panel just focusing on this one book alone, which at the time may have just seemed like, again, a nifty callback, you know, just a callback to a familiar book that we would have recognized, and that's certainly how I felt about it at the time. Whereas now, well, I'm sure you know that I am getting more and more convinced that Oda had bigger plans in mind, because the focus on this book continues in volume 42 of the SBS, where Oda provides even further information about the book. So in the SBS, Saga Queen asks, in volume 41, page 170, panel 5, Olvia and the others were throwing out books, and one of the books is called Bragman. Isn't that the book that Nami was looking for on volume 13, page 132? Isn't it? Isn't it? Alright, I've asked 3 times. If I'm wrong, I'll ding dong ditch 100,000 times as punishment. And to this, Oda answers in response, ooh, I'm surprised. Thank you for reading so deeply into the story. That's amazing. You are right. It's the book which had information about Little Garden, the island of giants. Bragman, as in liars, men who brag, is the title of this world-famous book, a book about adventures on the Grand Line. It records what the seafarers saw, all the unbelievable islands, mysterious people, and occurrences on the sea, and things which most most people around the world won't believe for an instant. They just laugh at them. When one thinks that this book were among those which the scholars in Ohara sacrificed their lives to protect, a warm feeling wells up inside me. And are these bragmen really liars? Please answer this question yourselves by reading about the adventures of Luffy and his gang. Alright then, see you in next volume's question corner. And first of all, let's just appreciate the name Soge Queen. I find that really cool. Soge Queen. Almost as cool as JoyGirl, but I digress. So moving swiftly along, see how Oda asks a somewhat rhetorical question in his response. He asks, are these bragmen whose journals and logs are contained in this collection really all liars? He leaves that for us to decide as we follow Luffy's journey. And I guess you and I, we can immediately say, well, no, they're not liars. Louis wrote about Little Garden, an island that the Straw Hats did visit, one that really was inhabited by giants, whether that be giants as in the subhuman species or giants in the great huge creatures that were living there. It's an island that we the audience witnessed for ourselves, so no, Louis obviously wasn't lying. But then why is this tale, why is this recollection contained in a book called Bragmen, a collection of stories from men who brag, men who tell lies, men who tell tall tales, a book about fictional romance? And I don't know about you, but this immediately reminded me of Jaya. I mean, who can forget the scene of Bellamy laughing at Luffy and the Straw Hats for their belief in the Sky Islands? Even though the crew knew, and we knew that that fantastical island really could exist. How Mont Blanc Cricket steadfastly believed in his great-great-great-great-grandfather and the tale of his ancestor despite being mocked by others for years on end. Mont Blanc Noland, who died to try to convince the world that his illustrious tales, his illustrious experiences were in fact real. Or how about even at the very beginning of the Jaya arc, where we became introduced to Sky Islands in the first place. So in the very first chapter of the Jaya arc, the crew encounter a massive ship that falls from the sky. And alongside this mysterious phenomenon was a equally mysterious narration, or more specifically, a narration of a quote from a physician named Willie Gallen, or Willie Karen, depending on which translation version you're reading. But Willie states, anything that humans can imagine is a possibility in reality, which is a quote that I find so interesting. For one, I think it's rare, even very rare, that Oda uses a quote within the narration box. The only other times that I can think of him doing it, apart from the 2 times that he used it with Louis' quotes, are one, later on in the same Jaya arc as the crew enters Mocktown. Here Oda inserts a quote from the Jew Wall's log, and the quote described Mocktown as a lawless town of derision beyond the world government's reach, where ruffians gather to fight and carouse. And it is actually still a mystery what or who Jew Wall is, whether it's supposed to be a play on the word jewel, like Jew Wall, jewel. Otherwise, it seems like it could be a reference to the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, which is a wall that's located in Jerusalem that's significant for various religions, including those of the Jewish faith. But I'm not so sure about the connections between that real life architecture to One Piece, or to Mocktown even more specifically, so if you have any ideas then please do let me know below. Also, otherwise, there was also a quote in the Loketown arc, a quote from Goldie Roger, who stated that as long as people hunger for freedom, there will always be inherited will and dreams. These things will always exist with the ebb and flow of the ages. And while in the case of the Mocktown example, I don't see the narration or the quotation being a huge significance other than to emphasize the roughness and the danger of the town. I guess just a way to add a little bit more flavor, provide a little bit more context for the arc, for the island that we are now entering. But otherwise, I feel like these quotes have always been very significant and quite strongly point to deeper messages, underlying messages and motifs within the story. I guess even in the case of Mocktown, you could argue that by setting up this town, by setting up this place as a location where people just deride you and scorn, emphasize how people will try to ridicule your dreams, Luffy's idealism, the message that we got by the end of the Skypiea arc, and also the meeting with Blackbeard, who is also a dreamer. I guess all of those those elements were more amplified. Because, of course, this Roger quote again highlights the importance of dreams. How dreaming is essential in a world where people aren't free. Because in dreams, in imagination, one can be free. And this link between dreams, imagination, and freedom is obviously such an important idea, such a big part of the series. It's one of the key driving motivators for Luffy, and therefore the rest of the Straw Hats in their journey. Luffy's thirst to experience all that the world has to offer, no matter how ludicrous or fantastical it may seem. That's often what steers the Straw Hats into their next adventure. It's how we follow Luffy and his journey. And in many ways, having faith in the magical, seemingly impossible, that's been getting more and more emphasis in the story. We've seen it very recently in both the Wano and the Egghead Island arcs. Wano because of Gear 5th, a devil fruit ability that is heavily related to the power of imagination. Having faith in things that are not always tangible or believable and then realizing that into reality. As well as Vegapunk's explanation or his hypothesis about the very nature of devil fruits itself. In the Egghead Island arc, he speculated that devil fruits are the manifestation of what humans believed could be possible for the human race. They harness their imaginations to turn into reality. And in fact, Vegapunk's theory about devil fruits sounds quite similar to a quote from what must be a well-known scientist, an in-series physicist that we just talked about, Willie Gallen, who did say anything that humans dream can be a possibility. Which has me wondering whether Willie Gallen is a physicist who was actually alive during the Void Century. And perhaps Vegapunk just happened upon one of his books. You know, perhaps Willie Gallen's was another one of the books that the O'Haran scholars saved, one that was uncovered from the debris of the Buster Call, taken to Elbaf, and maybe Vegapunk happened upon that book alongside all the others when he imprinted all of O'Haran scholars' knowledge into his memory. You know, maybe that's how Vegapunk came to develop his theories about the devil fruit in the first place. Because I do have to say, the way that Oda focused on how the O'Haran scholars were able to save Bragman, the fact that they saw it worthy of saving, the way that he emphasized that during his response to the SBS question, I think that was his way of saying that this book, Bragman, is actually very, very important. It's a significant resource that we're going to have to pay attention to. In any case, I think it's interesting that all of these quotes, all of these significant portions of narrations seem to circle around that same idea about dreams and what is real and what is imagined. And by the way, please do let me know if I've missed any other quotes, if I've missed any other narration boxes that quote other figures, especially in-series figures. Those are just the ones that I could remember. Anyway, so initially after reading chapter 1132, I thought that that may be just simply the bigger purpose of the Bragman book. That it's simply a condensed analogy or a symbol of a core element of the series about the romantic pull of adventure. A way to really emphasize that message about having the spirit to appreciate and be curious about the wonders of the world. You know, a way to always encourage characters and encourage us to dream, to imagine, to believe in the magical. And especially now that we are at Elbaf, an island steeped in lore and legends. An island where we will surely witness some magical and fantastical things. I had wondered whether this was simply Oda's way of bringing back the book to emphasize the motif. Believe and have faith that anything can be possible. You know, marvel and appreciate the magical land that is Elbaf. But then I came across something that really blew my mind. This was a comment left by Mav3622. Louis Arnot is an anagram for Usopp, not liar. Let that sink in for a second. Did you not just audibly gasp? Because that stopped me in my tracks. I mean, that really got me thinking. I always felt that this book was more important than it seemed, but what if it really is a hell of a lot more important? Was Louis Arnot really intentionally designed to be an anagram for Usopp, not liar? And if so, when Oda says Usopp, is he actually talking about Usopp? Is Louis Louis Arnot really just the clever pen name for the Straw Hat Sniper? And what on earth does this all really mean? Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let's just unpack some things a little bit. Firstly, this anagram rests on Louis Arnot being spelt a very specific way, because I have to say that I have seen it being spelt, being translated into various versions. I've seen it sometimes as Louis Arnot with an E at the end. Other times I've seen it as Louis Arnot, Louis Arnot with double T at the end. But I think this is a case where we are actually going to have faith and trust in the official translation, because it is according to the Viz version where Louis Arnot is spelt in a way where it can be jumbled up and rearranged to spell Uso not liar, which I have to say is really, really clever. Now, Mav goes on here to speculate that this means that Usopp is Louis Arnot himself, and that's especially because of chapter 1132, where we saw this warning message from Louis where he said, you know, don't stay at Elba for too long, and that jump-started a whole bunch of speculations, a whole bunch of theories about time travel, about time loops, a weird way that time passes in Elbaf, which is why people shouldn't stay there for too long. But like I said, I have already discussed my thoughts on why that is, why you can't stay at Elbaf for too long. And again, if you haven't watched that video, then I would recommend you to check that out. But for the purposes of this discussion, this clever wordplay definitely does make you go down speculation lane and start theorizing on, you know, whether the entire One Piece story is narrated by Usopp. Is One Piece being told from Usopp's point of view? Is he recounting the Straw Hats experience? Or you start wondering about the possibility of the Straw Hats actually being trapped in this confusing time loop, whether the journey that we are witnessing is actually one that they themselves have actually already been on in the past, or at least some version of themselves in the past, and it's just continuing in some ways, or they're reincarnating in other ways to keep experiencing the same journey over and over again. You know, are we in some repeating cyclical circular story? When Nami was reading Bragman, was she reading that in the then present, reading a book that Usopp in her past as well as her simultaneous future was writing? Like I said, confusing time loop. And I have actually made an entire video about the possibility of Luffy's journey being a cyclical story, so check that video out if you're interested. But another idea is, if Bragman is so-called a fictional novel, a story that people ridicule as false despite the fact that they're actually true, isn't that sort of how like Usopp's stories are false or lies until they're not? You know, was this an early wink from Oda about how Usopp's stories were all going to become true? Something that we're just going to have to realize as the story goes on. Or at the end of the day, was this just a clever wordplay inserted from Oda for shits and giggles? Because after all, Uso doesn't have to refer to Usopp, the character. In Japanese, Uso means a lie, so this anagram and Louis Arnot, that may have just been simply to emphasize the fact that the book Bragman is not all just written by liars, that it's not just a collection of lies. Maybe Oda was just trying to say lie, not lie. So maybe it wasn't related to Usopp at all. Though, having a main character like Usopp in the story, it's hard not to let your theory brain go wild. So I'm going to leave that for you to decide, because in any case, I do still have a feeling that all of these figures, like Louis Arnot, Willie Gallen, maybe the Drew Wall, or Drew Wall if it's a person, they're all going to be expanded upon someday. At the very least, yes, they have added further flavor into the story by adding to the world building in the series, but with Oda's continued inclusion of Bragman throughout the story, and with Willie Gallen's words fitting so well with another acclaimed scientist in the One Piece world, I have to say that I think that there is more coming. You know, maybe it will link to some of the other fantastical islands and the other seemingly impossible, seemingly magical elements that we've seen throughout the series. You know, islands or places like the Emerald City or the mysterious shadows that we saw at the Florian Triangle. Maybe those will all be explained via Bragman. Anyways, those are just some of my thoughts, but now please let me know what you think by leaving a comment below. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please like the video, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel because I would really appreciate it. If you want to support the channel further, you can also become one of these people, our wonderful Patreon and channel members. But as always, thank you for listening to another one of my ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.